means of doing it. And obviously for a pharaoh, he would have the very best processes available.
For the pharaoh's body, the act of mummification was an exacting process which lasted some 40 days. The most precious ingredients were used to anoint the body. Resins from pine and juniper trees were carried from the land of present-day Lebanon. Frankincense and myrrh were brought from today's Somalia and the Arabian Peninsula. Cinnamon and beeswax were also used to scent the corpse and seal the body. Once the body had been prepared, it was carefully wound in linen strips right down to individual fingers and toes. As centuries turned into millennia, the quest for the ideal mummy continued. Recognition of the mummy was so critical, Egyptians sought any technique which would help to preserve the likeness of the dead. The great pharaoh Ramesses II's most obvious facial feature was his large, hooked nose. Preserving this distinctive nose required an innovative solution. Zero radiographs made in 1977 revealed that the pharaoh's nasal cavity had been filled with dozens of peppercorns to ensure the legendary nose could be recognized for eternity.
In the New Kingdom, they had started inserting small onions under the eyelids because eyes are mainly water. So when you desiccate them, they all get sunken in. So for various of the royal mummies, we have small onions inserted in so that they have a nice naturalistic lump, so that it look like they're just sleeping.
Painted stones also replaced eyes. Sawdust, straw, sand, and lichens were all used at various times to stuff or mold facial features into some approximation of lifetime appearance. We don't know much about the people who actually performed the process of embalming the dead. We do know that the final wrapping of the mummy was often done by priests wearing masks of the god Anubis, the deity responsible for mummification. Once the wrapping of a pharaoh's mummy was complete, it was often covered with a funerary mask, bearing the likeness of the pharaoh. The most famous of these is the fabulous golden mask which covered the face of the New Kingdom boy king, Tutankhamun. Most experts agree that by the time the Roman Empire had taken over Egyptian civilization in the 1st century BC, the standards of mummification had changed. Although the practice remained of critical importance to Egyptians, the quality of work done by embalmers often slipped.
There are, archaeological horror stories of unwrapping what looks like a perfectly viable mummy and finding that it's actually the parts of several bodies which have just been pushed together, but identified to the family as Mr. X or Mrs. Y and given to them as the body to be buried. So that it looks like that embalming became a pretty sloppy process very often.
What never changed was the belief that the mummy must be identifiable to the deceased. These wonderful portraits of the dead were painted on boards and placed over the faces of mummies. They appear Roman in style, but they are in fact the faces of Egyptians. They stare out at the ages in the hope they will be granted their wish to spend eternity with their gods. Just as the process of mummification had slowly evolved, so did Egyptian attitudes about where to bury their loved ones. The earliest Egyptians had been buried in the sand. By the time of the first pharaohs, the concept of death and the afterlife had become more sophisticated, and Egyptians began to look for better ways to entomb the dead.
Over 3,000 years before the Christian era, Egyptian attitudes towards burial began to change. Simple pits in the desert were no longer seen as adequate. What was needed was a more permanent, substantial home for the dead, a structure with space for all the things that the dead would need on his long journey through to the afterlife, and a space for offerings and food for his refreshment.
The kind of tombs which evolved are known today as mastabas. They were simple rectangular structures with a single burial chamber. Groups of mastabas became cities for the dead. As funerary practices became more complex, so did the mastaba tombs. Egyptians believed that as long as the dead was honored and his name repeated, that person remained alive. Separate chambers were added to the mastabas where friends and loved ones could pay homage to the deceased and offer prayers in his name. For Egyptians, the dead person's spirit frequently returned to the body to rest and take refreshment. So food, water, even wine was brought to the mastaba for the deceased to enjoy.
Hundreds of mastabas were built here on the Giza Plateau. All around us are buried the high officials and attendants at the court of the pharaohs. Most of these tombs were excavated in the 1930s, but some remained hidden. Dr. Anne Roth of Howard University is leading a team here to explore this whole field of mastabas. They're trying to find the missing tombs and to learn more about the burial practices of the Old Kingdom.
Mastaba tombs, like the one I'm sitting on, were built in the Old Kingdom period and even earlier as sort of artificial mounds that would cover the body of the dead person. And we're coming back to some tombs that were excavated mostly in the late 1930s, and trying to find out, by looking at them a little more carefully, if we can trace the activities of the people who built them and the people who owned them and the people who worked here as priests and the people who visited here as tourists, and really sort of reconstruct the life in the cemetery.
So this is one of the mastabas that you've been re-excavating?
Not this one, actually, the one over there. Brad spent a couple days clearing off where this mastaba had fallen down over this one, and immediately when he started clearing the actual surface of the mastaba itself, he found first one burial chamber and then another. And these are unusual because they don't seem to have shafts above them. We haven't quite figured out how they got into them. They may have actually buried the people and then built the whole mastaba over the top of them.
So Brad, hi, you've been busy.
Yes.
Tell me what you found here.
Well, when we first opened the chamber, there was the top of a skull, so we knew that there was a burial here. This one is apparently a rather young woman, perhaps somewhere around 18. And we can tell that from the way that the bones have not quite completely fused. As you grow, of course, bones change.
The burial here is only one of two burials that we think we've got in this tomb. We were looking for the shaft of that, and while we were looking for the shaft, we ran across a second one, which I think you're about ready to open, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so. This body is partially excavated, but in this other spot, we have probably a complete burial.
It's extraordinary. May we have a look?
Allison, we've got another body for you. Can you see anything down there?
I can see a skull. Would that be a tibia or a leg bone?
Yes, it's a leg bone.
What will you do now in order to uncover the skeleton?
Well, I'll do a lot of sweeping, trying to carefully not move the bones. The problem with these burials are, as you've noticed, it's a very small space.
Basically, it does look disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
It's
To say the least.
possibly female. The bones are pretty small, clearly an adult.
All right, we'll have to dig it out and find out what it is, who it is. Great. Great, Mabruk. Another body. Excavating bodies is a sort of scary thing to do, actually, because they are people, and we have to remember they are people, and we try and treat them with a lot of respect. We had one body that was found with the hands underneath the head, and the head was resting, and the hands were resting on a little stone pillow. It tells you almost something about their personality, and there's a real sense of connection with these ancient people that were buried in these tombs.
This is the skull of a woman who died about 4,400 years ago. She was between 30 and 39 years old, probably about 35. And so dying at that age was not uncommon. She's been kind of interesting. She has an active dental abscess. The abscess, you can see it here. It's in her left first molar, and you see these two holes here. Probably very painful and possibly related to her death. It is possible to die from an untreated dental abscess. The Egyptians had a very high rate of tooth wear because they ground their grain on grindstones, and that put a lot of grit into the flour, and there's a lot of ambient dust. And so you can imagine that a lifetime of eating bread made that way, it's like chewing on sandpaper.
Through their work, Anne Roth and her colleagues may be offering the ancient people they study the eternal life they so desired.
We hope we make them live longer by studying them and telling something about their lives, because the ancient Egyptians believed that part of your soul was what other people thought of you. So by forming these human connections with these dead people again, we hope we're atoning for any disrespect that we may be showing to their bones.
The bones contained in these mastabas at Giza belonged to common middle-class people. But even for pharaohs, death at last arrived. Egyptians believed that when their king passed on, he joined the great god Re to endlessly carry the sun across the sky in a celestial boat. To make sure the pharaohs had a craft at their disposal for this important journey, boats such as this were sometimes buried near the royal tombs. At first glance, this would seem to be an unlikely spot to find such a royal boat, much less a fleet of them. These huge walls are almost all that remain of a vast complex of mortuary temples. They were built in the desert near the ancient town of Abydos to honor dead kings who ruled Egypt almost 5,000 years ago. It was here in 1991 that Dr. David O'Connor of New York University's Institute of Fine Arts made a startling discovery. The first of a number of boats buried just outside these walls. New discoveries were being made even as I arrived. Matthew Adams is Associate Director of the project. He explained how these ancient vessels were first found.
We noticed initially in our work there were some very unusual walls poking up out of the sand just in this area. Let me
I
show
can
you.
see them, yes.
Initially, we thought that these were the walls of some building. You can see the mud bricks here and just a bit of the original plaster face of the wall. But they had these unusual shapes at the end. Here's a corner, and the end comes around and is curved, rounded.
So what was the answer to the mystery?
The answer to the mystery is that these walls were built to contain wooden boats. The boats were placed in a small pit, then the brickwork was built up against the outside. Each one of the boats inside these structures is filled with mud brick, and then the whole thing was capped off with a nice mud plaster.
And they're actually in there now, those wooden boats?
There are wooden boats inside these structures right now.
And what's the boulder?
The boulder, we think, is some kind of symbolic anchor to permanently or eternally moor the boats in place.
It's amazing. So what you have here is walls surrounding an actual wooden boat, and this is the prow or the stern of the boat?
We're not quite sure whether it's the prow or the stern, which end is the front or the back.
Clear shape, though, isn't it?
Very clear, yes.
How long is it altogether?
The longest is about 90 feet by about 10 or 12 feet wide.
90 feet?
90 feet.
These would be substantial things, wouldn't they?
Very substantial craft.
It's a big job clearing away the tons of sand which cover these boats. After that, the plaster caps must be carefully removed, and one can begin to sense what these boats once looked like. As the sand is swept away, it's possible to reveal the wooden planks of the long, narrow vessels placed here almost 5,000 years ago.
Wow, look at that.
Here you actually see a number of the longitudinal planks which ran the length of the boat. You can see the spaces between them.
So these planks seem to be really thick here.
That's right. They're about between 2 and 3 inches thick, and we're not quite sure about the length yet.
We don't have enough exposed.
And what wood is this?
It seems to be cedar wood from modern Lebanon.
It's 1,000 miles away.
That's right.
So the shape of it, this will be the bottom